Welcome to One Book, One Coffee, where we delve into the stories that shape us, one page at a time. Today, you've chosen to explore The Prince of Tides by Pat Conroy, and that choice speaks volumes about you. In a world full of fleeting distractions, you've chosen to immerse yourself in the profound and the lasting. You're not just consuming content, you're investing in a transformative journey. The Prince of Tides is extraordinary for its intricate tapestry of family, love, and the haunting threads of the past. Pat Conroy weaves a narrative that is not only moving but deeply insightful into the human condition. Respected not just by readers worldwide, this book garnered acclaim from literary giants and found its way onto the screen with a celebrated adaptation. Its impact resonates far and wide, capturing the hearts of those who dare to confront the complexities of life. Written by Pat Conroy, a man whose own life was shaped by a tumultuous upbringing in the southern United States, this novel is both a personal catharsis and a universal exploration of family dynamics. Conroy's struggles with his own family's history and his relentless pursuit of healing and understanding are what drove him to pen this masterpiece. His ability to transform personal pain into art is a testament to his resilience and talent. Now, a quick note before we dive in. This is a detailed chapter-by-chapter walkthrough, so it's going to be a longer session. Take your time with it. There's no rush. If you need to step away, save this video to your watch later or forward the link to yourself on WhatsApp so you can pick up right where you left off. So grab your coffee, settle in, and let's walk through this book together, chapter by chapter, idea by idea. Let's begin. A journey through the scars and healing of a family. Pat Conroy, known for his lyrical prose and deep connections to the American South, was inspired by his own family's turbulent history to write The Prince of Tides. His work often explores themes of family, trauma, and redemption, drawing deeply from his personal experiences. Welcome back to One Book, One Coffee, where we dive deep into the stories that shape us. Today, we're beginning our journey through Pat Conroy's masterpiece, The Prince of Tides, and I have to tell you, this book hits differently when you really understand what Conroy is doing from the very first page. Pour yourself something warm, settle in, and let's explore how a master storyteller sets up one of the most emotionally powerful novels ever written. The prologue of The Prince of Tides doesn't ease you into the story like most books do. Instead, Conroy grabs you by the shoulders and whispers, "I'm about to tell you something that will change how you see family, trauma, and the stories we tell ourselves to survive." It's like sitting across from someone at a coffee shop who suddenly says, "Let me tell you about the worst thing that ever happened to my family," and you know you're about to hear something that will stay with you forever. Conroy begins with Tom Wingo, our narrator, introducing us to his sister Savannah, and right away, we understand that this isn't going to be a gentle family story. Tom tells us that his sister has attempted suicide, and he's been called to New York to help her psychiatrist understand their shared past. Now, think about this for a moment. How many of us have family stories that we've never fully told anyone? Secrets that sit like stones in our chest, weighing us down year after year. Conroy understands that every family has its own mythology, its own version of events, and sometimes those stories are all that stand between us and complete destruction. What's brilliant about this opening is how Conroy immediately establishes that memory itself is going to be a character in this story. Tom doesn't just say, "Here's what happened." Instead, he acknowledges that memory is slippery, unreliable, and often more about survival than truth. It's like when you're telling someone about your childhood, and you realize you're not sure if you actually remember the event, or if you've just heard the story so many times that it feels like memory. Conroy gets this. He understands that the stories we tell about our past are often more important than what actually happened. The prologue introduces us to the lowcountry of South Carolina, and Conroy doesn't just describe a place, he makes it breathe. The tidal marshes, the shrimp boats, the way the light falls across the water at sunset. This isn't just pretty scenery, it's the DNA of the story. The tides themselves become a metaphor for how trauma and healing work in our lives. Think about how tides function. They come in and they go out, but they're always moving, always changing the landscape, always leaving something behind. That's exactly how Conroy treats the painful memories that haunt the Wingo family. What strikes me most about this opening is how Conroy acknowledges that telling painful stories is an act of courage. Tom isn't just recounting events to help his sister, he's excavating his own buried trauma. It reminds me of something that happens in therapy, where you think you're there to talk about one thing, but you end up discovering that the real issue is something you've been avoiding for decades. Tom believes he's the stable one, the one who escaped relatively unscathed, but Conroy hints that Tom's wounds might be just as deep as Savannah's, just hidden under a different kind of survival strategy. The genius of this prologue is how it establishes that this story is going to be about more than just one family's tragedy. It's going to be about how we inherit pain from previous generations, how we pass it on despite our best intentions, and how sometimes the only way to heal is to finally tell the truth about what happened. In our modern world, where we're finally starting to understand concepts like generational trauma and the way family dysfunction ripples through time, Conroy's insights feel remarkably prescient. Conroy also introduces the idea that storytelling itself can be a form of healing. Tom isn't just remembering, he's crafting a narrative that might save both him and his sister. It's like when you finally find the words to explain something that's been haunting you for years, and suddenly the experience has less power over you. The act of putting chaos into story form, of finding meaning in suffering, becomes its own kind of medicine. As we close this prologue and prepare to dive deeper into the Wingo family story, Conroy has already accomplished something remarkable. He's made us understand that we're not just going to be observers of this family's pain, we're going to be witnesses to the slow, difficult work of healing. And that, my friends, is what makes great literature so powerful. It doesn't just tell us a story, it shows us something true about our own lives. Next time, we'll explore how Conroy begins to unpack the Wingo family's history, and trust me, you'll want to have tissues nearby. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone at a coffee shop, and they lean forward with that look in their eyes that says they're about to tell you something that will change how you see families forever. That's exactly what Pat Conroy does when he pulls back the curtain on the Wingo family in The Prince of Tides. But here's the thing about family stories. They're never really just about one family, are they? They're mirrors that reflect something universal about the human condition, about the ways we hurt each other and heal each other, often simultaneously. The Wingo family operates like a beautifully dysfunctional orchestra where everyone's playing from different sheet music, yet somehow they create this haunting melody that resonates long after the last note fades. At the center of this symphony sits Henry Wingo, the father, a man who carries the weight of his own broken dreams like stones in his pockets. Think about the fathers you know, or maybe the father you had. How many of them learned to express love through criticism, thinking they were preparing their children for a harsh world? Henry Wingo embodies this tragic contradiction perfectly. He's a shrimper by trade, a man whose hands know the feel of nets and salt water, but whose heart has been calcified by disappointment and rage. Now, think about this for a moment. What happens when someone who's never learned to process their own pain becomes responsible for shaping young minds? Conroy shows us through the Wingo children, Tom, Savannah, and Luke. Each child becomes a different experiment in survival, a different answer to the question of how to navigate a household where love and violence dance together like old partners who have forgotten the steps but can't stop moving. Tom, our narrator, develops what I like to call the diplomatic immunity approach to family trauma. He becomes the translator, the peace negotiator, the one who learns to read the emotional weather patterns in his house and adjust accordingly. You know someone like this, don't you? Maybe you are someone like this. It's that person in every family who somehow becomes responsible for everyone else's feelings, who learns to swallow their own needs to keep the peace. Tom's story reminds us that sometimes the most wounded person in the room is the one who appears to be holding everything together. Then there's Savannah, the poet, the sensitive soul who absorbs every emotional tremor in the household like a seismograph. Her talent becomes both her salvation and her curse. She can transform pain into beauty, but she can't escape feeling everything so deeply that it threatens to drown her. Conroy's portrayal of Savannah speaks to anyone who's ever felt too much in a world that often rewards emotional numbness. Her struggles with mental illness aren't presented as weakness, but as the natural consequence of a heart that refuses to build walls against feeling. Luke represents something different entirely. He's the fighter, the one who meets violence with violence, who refuses to bend even when bending might save him. Every family has a Luke, that person who would rather break than compromise, who carries their pain like a weapon. His story asks us uncomfortable questions about masculinity, about what happens when boys are taught that anger is the only acceptable emotion. But here's where Conroy's genius really shines through. He shows us that even in families where love looks like war, where care is expressed through criticism, where protection feels like abandonment, there are still these moments of unexpected grace. The Wingo family doesn't just wound each other, they also save each other in ways both large and small. They develop this intricate language of survival, these inside jokes and shared memories that become lifelines during the darkest moments. What makes their story so compelling is how recognizable it feels, even if your own family dynamics were completely different. We all know what it's like to love people who hurt us, to be shaped by forces we didn't choose, to carry family patterns forward even when we swear we won't repeat them. The Wingo family becomes a case study in how trauma gets passed down like heirloom china, carefully, inevitably, and often without anyone realizing what's really being handed over. Conroy doesn't offer easy answers or neat resolutions because families aren't neat, are they? Instead, he gives us something more valuable, the recognition that understanding our family stories, really understanding them, is the first step toward writing different endings for ourselves and the people we love. The Wingo family teaches us that healing isn't about forgetting or forgiving everything, but about seeing clearly, feeling deeply, and choosing consciously how we want to carry our stories forward. As we move deeper into Tom's journey, remember this foundation Conroy has laid, that families are both our greatest wounds and our most profound teachers, and sometimes the bravest thing we can do is simply tell the truth about both. So there we are with Tom Wingo, sitting across from us like that friend who finally decides to tell you the real story after years of keeping it locked away. You know the one, the guy who's been carrying this weight around so long it's become part of his posture. Pat Conroy doesn't just hand us Tom's story. He makes us feel like we're sitting in that New York therapist's office right alongside him, watching this Southern man slowly peel back the layers of a life that's been shaped by violence, beauty, and the kind of family secrets that echo through generations. Think about this for a moment. How many of us carry around versions of our parents that we never asked for? Tom Wingo is fighting a war on multiple fronts, and the enemy isn't just external. It's the voice of his father, Henry Wingo, that brutal shrimp boat captain whose idea of love was delivered through fists and whose legacy runs through Tom's veins like contaminated water. Conroy shows us how Tom has spent his entire adult life trying not to become his father, yet finding himself trapped in patterns that feel as inevitable as the South Carolina tides. The brilliance of Tom's struggle lies in how recognizable it is to anyone who's ever looked in the mirror and seen their parents' face staring back at them. Here's a man who coaches football, who should be the epitome of masculine control and strength, yet he's drowning in his own emotional undertow. His marriage to Sally is crumbling not because they don't love each other, but because Tom has never learned how to love without the armor he's worn since childhood. He's like a man trying to swim while wearing a suit of mail. The very thing he thinks protects him is what's pulling him under. Now consider the layers of Tom's pain. There's the obvious trauma, the violence he witnessed and experienced as a child, the way his father turned their home into a battleground where survival meant learning to disappear. But Conroy digs deeper, showing us how Tom's struggle isn't just about escaping his past. It's about the impossible task of honoring the beauty of his childhood while acknowledging its horror. The lowcountry that shaped him is both Eden and hell, and Tom can't separate the sweetgrass from the blood in the soil. What makes Tom's journey so compelling is how it mirrors our modern understanding of generational trauma. Long before we had terms like toxic masculinity or emotional intelligence, Conroy was exploring how damage gets passed down like a family heirloom nobody wants, but everyone inherits. Tom's father wasn't born evil. He was shaped by his own father's brutality, creating this unbroken chain of hurt that stretches back through Southern history like kudzu, choking out everything healthy in its path. The therapy sessions with Dr. Lowenstein become this fascinating dance between resistance and revelation. Tom doesn't want to be there. He's only in New York because his sister Savannah attempted suicide, and someone needs to help the psychiatrist understand the Wingo family mythology. But as he tells their story, ostensibly to help Savannah, he's forced to confront his own ghosts. It's like watching someone try to help a friend move, only to realize they're carrying their own furniture out to the truck. Think about how often we do this in our own lives, how we can see clearly into other people's problems while remaining blind to our own patterns. Tom can articulate his family's dysfunction with the precision of a surgeon, but he can't see how that same dysfunction is eating away at his own marriage, his relationship with his children, his sense of himself as a man. He's become an expert narrator of his own tragedy while remaining helpless to change the script. The real insight Conroy offers us through Tom's struggle is that healing isn't about forgetting or forgiving. It's about integration. Tom has to learn to hold multiple truths simultaneously, that his childhood was both magical and terrible, that his father was both monster and victim, that the South that shaped him is both beautiful and poisoned. This isn't the kind of neat resolution we see in most stories. It's the messy, ongoing work of being human in a world where love and violence often wear the same face. As we move deeper into Tom's story, we begin to understand that his struggle isn't just personal, it's archetypal. He represents every person who's ever had to decide whether to repeat their family's patterns or break them, whether to stay loyal to a destructive legacy or risk everything to create something new. And that, my friends, is a battle that never really ends. It just gets fought on different ground, with better tools, and hopefully, with more wisdom than the generation before. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone you love, watching them slowly disappear before your eyes, not through death, but through something far more terrifying, the gradual erasure of their essential self. This is exactly what Tom Wingo faces when his twin sister Savannah attempts suicide in her Manhattan apartment. And it's here that Pat Conroy reveals one of the most profound truths about family trauma. How the wounds we carry from childhood don't just affect us individually, but ripple through generations like stones thrown into still water. Now think about this for a moment. How many of us have that one family member who seems to carry the weight of everyone's pain? Savannah Wingo is that person, brilliant, artistic, sensitive to the point of breaking. She's a poet whose words can capture the beauty of a low country sunset, but whose mind has become a prison of memories too painful to bear. When we first encounter her crisis, she's not just dealing with a momentary breakdown. She's drowning in decades of accumulated trauma that began in their childhood home in Colleton, South Carolina. Conroy doesn't give us Savannah's story in neat clinical terms. Instead, he shows us how mental illness in families is like living with a beautiful, dangerous storm that never quite passes. One day Savannah might be the most enchanting person in the room, spinning stories that make everyone laugh until their sides hurt. The next, she's unreachable, lost in a darkness that no amount of love or logic can penetrate. Sound familiar? In our modern world, we see this pattern everywhere. the brilliant colleague who suddenly can't get out of bed, the creative friend whose gifts seem inextricably linked to their struggles, the family member whose sensitivity to the world becomes both their superpower and their kryptonite. What makes Savannah's crisis so devastating is that it forces Tom to confront something he spent his entire adult life avoiding: the truth about their childhood. You see, the Wingo children didn't just grow up poor in the South. They grew up in a household where violence and beauty existed side by side, where their father's rage could explode without warning, and where their mother's desperate attempts to maintain appearances created a kind of emotional whiplash that left all three children, Tom, Savannah, and Luke, struggling to understand what love actually looks like. Here's where Conroy's genius really shines. He shows us that Savannah's breakdown isn't just about her individual pain, it's about the collective trauma of an entire family system. Think about it this way. If a family is like a mobile, those delicate sculptures where everything hangs in perfect balance, what happens when one piece starts spinning out of control? Everything else begins to sway and shake. Savannah's crisis sends tremors through everyone who loves her, forcing them all to examine the foundations they've built their lives on. When Tom travels to New York to help his sister, he's not just playing the role of concerned brother. He's stepping into a world that mirrors his own internal landscape, Manhattan's towering buildings and crushing anonymity reflecting the emotional walls he's built around his own heart. The city becomes a character in itself, this place where people can disappear into crowds while remaining completely isolated, much like Savannah has disappeared into her illness while surrounded by people who care about her. Now, here's what's particularly relevant to our modern understanding of mental health. Conroy was writing about trauma and its generational impact decades before these concepts became part of our everyday vocabulary. Today, we have terms like complex PTSD and generational trauma, but back then, families like the Wingos were simply told to get over it or pull themselves together. Savannah's crisis becomes a mirror for anyone who's ever watched someone they love struggle with depression, anxiety, or the kind of deep emotional wounds that don't heal with time alone. The beautiful and heartbreaking thing about Savannah's story is how it reveals the double-edged nature of artistic sensitivity. Her ability to feel everything so deeply, the beauty of a Carolina marsh at sunset, the pain of a childhood memory, the weight of the world's suffering, is both what makes her an extraordinary poet and what threatens to destroy her. It's like being born without emotional skin. Everything touches you more intensely, but it also means that every hurt cuts deeper. As we move deeper into this story, we'll discover that Savannah's crisis becomes the catalyst for everyone around her to finally face the truths they've been running from. Sometimes it takes watching someone we love nearly slip away to realize how much of ourselves we've been hiding, even from ourselves. Her breakdown becomes, paradoxically, the beginning of everyone's breakthrough. You know how sometimes life sends you exactly the person you need, even when you're not looking for them. That's what happens when Tom Wingo walks into Dr. Susan Lowenstein's office in New York City. He's come to help his suicidal twin sister Savannah, but what he finds is something he never expected: a psychiatrist who's about to turn his own world upside down. Picture this scene with me. Tom, this broken-down football coach from South Carolina, finds himself in the sterile, sophisticated world of Manhattan psychiatry. He's carrying all the weight of his family's secrets, their trauma, their dysfunction, and he's supposed to somehow help Dr. Lowenstein understand his sister well enough to save her life. But here's the beautiful irony that Conroy weaves so masterfully. In trying to heal Savannah, Tom discovers he needs healing just as desperately. Dr. Susan Lowenstein isn't your typical literary psychiatrist. She's not some cold, clinical figure hiding behind a notepad. Conroy creates her as a fully realized woman dealing with her own marital struggles, her own sense of disconnection, her own search for meaning. Think about how refreshing this is. How often do we see the healer as someone who also needs healing? It's like when you realize your therapist or your doctor or your mentor is just as human and vulnerable as you are. There's something both unsettling and comforting about that recognition. What makes their relationship so compelling is how it develops through the process of excavating the Wingo family history. Tom becomes the storyteller, the keeper of memories, and Dr. Lowenstein becomes both audience and guide. It's like watching someone learn to trust again, one painful story at a time. Now, think about this dynamic. Isn't this what happens in any real healing relationship? Whether it's with a therapist, a close friend, or even a stranger who becomes important to us, healing often requires us to tell our stories to someone who's willing to really listen. The genius of Conroy's portrayal lies in how he shows that Dr. Lowenstein's professional expertise isn't enough on its own. Yes, she has the training, the degrees, the clinical knowledge, but what really matters is her capacity for empathy, her willingness to be changed by Tom's stories. It reminds me of how the best teachers aren't just those who know their subject matter, but those who allow themselves to be taught by their students. Dr. Lowenstein doesn't just analyze Tom's family dysfunction. She absorbs it, feels it, and in doing so becomes part of the healing process rather than just an observer of it. There's this beautiful complexity in how their relationship evolves from professional to personal. In our modern world, we're so concerned about boundaries, about keeping things compartmentalized, but Conroy suggests that real healing often requires us to blur those lines a bit. Dr. Lowenstein's growing involvement in Tom's life, her genuine care for his well-being, her willingness to let him into her own struggles. This isn't unprofessional conduct. It's human connection at its most authentic. Think about the people who have helped you heal from something difficult in your life. Chances are, they weren't just following some prescribed formula for helping. They probably shared something of themselves with you, made themselves vulnerable in return for your vulnerability. That's exactly what happens between Tom and Dr. Lowenstein. She offers him not just her professional skills, but her attention, her curiosity, her genuine concern for his well-being. What's particularly relevant today is how their relationship challenges our assumptions about who needs help and who provides it. We live in an age where everyone seems to be struggling with something: anxiety, depression, trauma, disconnection. The old model of the expert who has it all figured out helping the broken person who doesn't is giving way to something more mutual, more reciprocal. Dr. Lowenstein gains as much from Tom as she gives to him, and that's not a failure of professional boundaries. It's an acknowledgement of our shared humanity. The way Conroy writes their sessions together, you can feel the careful dance of revelation and protection, of opening up and holding back. It's like watching someone learn to trust again after betrayal, or learning to hope again after disappointment. Dr. Lowenstein creates a safe space not through clinical detachment, but through genuine engagement, and that makes all the difference. As we watch Tom begin to trust Dr. Lowenstein with his family's darkest secrets, we're witnessing something profound about the nature of healing itself. It's not just about fixing what's broken, it's about finding someone who can witness our pain without flinching, who can hold our stories with care, and who can help us see ourselves with compassion rather than judgment. And sometimes, just sometimes, that person appears exactly when we need them most, disguised as something else entirely. Picture this. You're sitting on a porch in the South Carolina lowcountry, Spanish moss hanging like nature's curtains from ancient live oaks, and the air so thick with humidity you could practically swim through it. This is the world Pat Conroy creates in The Prince of Tides. And here's something fascinating: the landscape isn't just a pretty backdrop for his story. It's practically a character itself, shaping every moment, every relationship, every wound that needs healing. When Tom Wingo begins telling his family's story to his sister's psychiatrist in New York, he doesn't start with people or events. He starts with place. He talks about the tidal marshes of South Carolina, those mysterious waterways that breathe with the rhythm of the ocean, filling and emptying twice a day like the lungs of the earth itself. Now, think about this. Why would a man trying to save his sister's life begin with geography? Because Conroy understood something profound. We are shaped by the land we come from as surely as clay is shaped by the potter's hands. The low country that Conroy paints is a place of impossible beauty and hidden darkness, much like the Wingo family itself. Those tidal creeks that Tom remembers so vividly, they're not just waterways, they're metaphors for the way secrets flow in and out of families, sometimes hidden, sometimes revealed, always moving. The landscape pulses with this ancient rhythm that mirrors the emotional tides of the story. When the water is high, memories flood back. When it recedes, it leaves behind the debris of the past, exposed and raw. But here's where it gets really interesting. The South that Conroy describes isn't the romanticized plantation fantasy that Hollywood loves to sell us. This is the real South, complicated and contradictory, where breathtaking natural beauty coexists with profound human ugliness. The same landscape that produces magnificent sunsets over endless marshlands also harbors the kind of family violence that nearly destroys the Wingo children. It's a place where genteel manners can mask unspeakable cruelties, where the code of Southern hospitality often serves to keep terrible secrets buried. Consider how this plays out in our modern world. Don't we all carry the geography of our childhood in our bones? Whether you grew up in the concrete canyons of Manhattan or the endless wheat fields of Kansas, that landscape becomes part of your internal compass. It shapes how you see space, how you relate to nature, how you define home. For the Wingos, the Low Country represents both paradise and prison, the place that made them and nearly broke them. The Southern culture Conroy depicts is equally complex. There's this tradition of storytelling that runs through the narrative like a river, the idea that stories aren't just entertainment, they're survival tools. Tom becomes the family's designated storyteller, the one who must make sense of their chaos through narrative. This reflects a deeper Southern tradition where stories serve as both shields and weapons, ways of preserving dignity in the face of defeat, methods of passing down wisdom and warning in equal measure. Think about the way Tom describes his father's violence, or his mother's desperate attempts to maintain appearances. These aren't just personal failings, they're symptoms of a culture that prizes image over truth, that teaches men to express emotion through anger and women to endure suffering in silence. The Spanish moss that drapes everything in the Low Country becomes a perfect metaphor for this, beautiful from a distance. But up close, it's actually a parasite that slowly strangles the trees it adorns. What makes this particularly relevant today is how Conroy shows us that you can't heal from trauma without understanding the forces that shaped it. Tom can't save Savannah, and he can't save himself, until he's willing to excavate the layers of Southern mythology that have buried their family's truth. The land itself becomes a character in this process. Those tidal marshes that seem to hold memory in their muddy bottoms, those ancient oaks that have witnessed generations of joy and sorrow. The genius of Conroy's approach is how he uses the specificity of place to reveal universal truths about family, trauma, and healing. Yes, this is distinctly Southern literature, but the emotional geography he maps, the way childhood landscapes become the architecture of our adult souls, that's something every reader can recognize. We all have our own tidal marshes, our own Spanish moss, our own complicated relationships with the places that made us. As we dive deeper into Tom's journey from the Carolina coast to the concrete jungle of New York, we'll see how carrying this Southern landscape within him becomes both his burden and his salvation, shaping every relationship and every revelation that follows. Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who's spent their entire life running from a house fire, only to realize they've been carrying the matches in their pocket all along. That's Tom Wingo and Pat Conroy's masterpiece, and as we settle in with our coffee today, we're diving into one of the most emotionally raw journeys ever put to paper, Tom's confrontation with the ghosts that have been haunting his family for generations. You know that feeling when you're cleaning out an old closet and you find a box you'd forgotten about. Your heart skips a beat because part of you knows that whatever's inside is going to change everything. That's exactly where Tom finds himself as he begins peeling back the layers of his family's carefully constructed lies. Conroy doesn't just tell us about trauma. He shows us how it moves through a family like water through cracked foundation, seeping into every corner until the whole structure threatens to collapse. Now, think about this for a moment. How many of us have family stories that exist in whispers and half-sentences? Those conversations that stop abruptly when children walk into the room. Tom's journey begins with his sister Savannah's suicide attempt, but what he discovers is that her breakdown isn't an isolated incident. It's the inevitable result of secrets that have been festering for decades like an untreated wound. The brilliance of Conroy's storytelling lies in how he reveals that confronting the past isn't a single moment of revelation, but rather a series of small excavations. Tom starts by admitting to Dr. Lowenstein, Savannah's psychiatrist, that his family has always been experts at what he calls the art of forgetting. But here's the thing about forgetting. It's not really forgetting at all, is it? It's more like shoving everything into a mental storage unit and losing the key. The stuff is still there, taking up space, affecting how you move through the world. As Tom begins to unlock these memories, Conroy shows us something profound about the nature of family trauma. It's not just about what happened. It's about the stories we tell ourselves about what happened, the roles we assign ourselves, and the ways we learn to survive. Tom has spent his adult life playing the role of the family comedian, the one who deflects pain with humor. Sound familiar? How many of us have developed similar coping mechanisms, becoming the peacekeeper, the achiever, the invisible one? The most devastating revelation comes when Tom finally confronts the central trauma that has shaped his family, the night when violence invaded their home and changed everything. Conroy doesn't sensationalize this moment. Instead, he shows us how trauma fractures not just individuals but entire family systems. Each member of the Wingo family has carried their piece of this burden differently. Tom's mother, Leela, has transformed it into a fierce determination to rise above their circumstances. His father has let it calcify into rage and disappointment. And Savannah, she's internalized it until it became a poison she couldn't purge. But here's what makes this story so relevant to our modern understanding of mental health. Tom's journey isn't about achieving some perfect resolution or healing. It's about learning to live with the truth. Think about our current conversations around therapy, trauma-informed care, and breaking generational cycles. Tom's experience with Dr. Lowenstein mirrors what so many people discover when they finally seek help. That healing isn't about erasing the past, but about changing your relationship with it. What strikes me most powerfully about this section is how Conroy illustrates that confronting family trauma is both an individual and collective act. Tom can't heal Savannah by revealing their shared secrets, but he can stop perpetuating the silence that has poisoned their family for so long. It's like finally turning on the lights in a house where everyone has been stumbling around in the dark, bumping into furniture and each other, pretending they could see just fine. The modern parallels are impossible to ignore. In our age of therapy speak and trauma awareness, we might think we're more evolved than the Wingo family, but are we really? How many of us still struggle with family dynamics established decades ago? How often do we find ourselves repeating patterns we swore we'd never perpetuate? As Tom's story unfolds, we see that confronting the past isn't a heroic act of courage. It's often messy, painful, and incomplete. Sometimes the truth doesn't set you free. Sometimes it just gives you different chains to wear. But there's something profoundly liberating about choosing your chains rather than inheriting them blindly. And that, my friend, is a lesson worth carrying with us as we turn the page and see what other truths Tom will have to face in his journey towards something that might, eventually, resemble peace. So we've been talking about the raw, unflinching world that Pat Conroy creates in The Prince of Tides, and now we need to dive into something that might hit closer to home than you'd expect. Let me pour myself another cup here, because we're about to explore one of the most complex and beautiful aspects of this novel. The bonds between siblings that can both save you and destroy you, sometimes in the same breath. Picture this for a moment. You're sitting around a dinner table with your siblings, and there's this unspoken language happening. A raised eyebrow here, a knowing glance there, maybe a slight shake of the head that says, "Don't bring up that thing about Mom." That's the world Tom, Savannah, and Luke Wingo inhabit, except their secret language has been forged in something much darker than typical family dysfunction. These three children created their own survival system in a house where love came wrapped in violence, where beauty existed alongside brutality, and where protecting each other became their religion. Now think about this. How do siblings navigate trauma together? Because that's really what we're watching unfold here. Tom, our narrator and reluctant hero, Savannah, the brilliant poet teetering on the edge of madness, and Luke, the golden boy who carries his own invisible wounds. They're like three trees that grew up twisted around each other in a storm. Their roots are so intertwined that you can't tell where one begins and another ends, and that's both their greatest strength and their most dangerous vulnerability. Conroy shows us something profound about sibling relationships that most of us recognize but rarely talk about. These aren't just the people who shared your childhood, they're the witnesses to your origin story. They know the secret language of your family's pain, the specific way your mother's voice changed when she was afraid, the sound your father's footsteps made when he was angry. Tom, Savannah, and Luke are bound together by this terrible intimacy of shared survival. But here's where it gets really interesting, and this is something that resonates deeply in our modern understanding of family dynamics. The very thing that makes them so close also makes them incredibly fragile. When Savannah attempts suicide, it's not just her individual pain we're seeing, it's the collapse of their collective defense system. Tom's journey to New York to help his sister isn't just about saving Savannah. It's about confronting the fact that their childhood survival tactics might not work in the adult world. Think about the siblings in your own life, or the families you know. How often do we see this pattern where children who survive difficult childhoods together develop these incredibly intense bonds? They become each other's parents, protectors, and witnesses. But then, as adults, they sometimes struggle to figure out how to love each other without that shared crisis to unite them. Or worse, one sibling's breakdown threatens to pull the others back into that survival mode they thought they'd escaped. Conroy captures this with such brutal honesty. The way Tom talks about Savannah isn't just brotherly love. It's the fierce protectiveness of someone who helped raise her, who stood guard while she slept, who learned to read the weather patterns of her moods before he could properly read books. And Luke, the brother who seems to have escaped relatively unscathed, carries his own burden of being the one who got away, the guilt of surviving when others struggle. What's particularly brilliant about Conroy's exploration is how he shows us that sibling love isn't always healthy love. Sometimes it's possessive, sometimes it's enabling, sometimes it's so intense that it becomes another kind of prison. Tom's relationship with Savannah is beautiful and devoted, but it's also complicated by his need to be her savior, his inability to let her fall and learn to get back up on her own. This speaks to something very contemporary about family dynamics and mental health. We're learning more and more about how childhood trauma affects not just individuals, but entire family systems. The Wingo siblings represent this perfectly. They're not just three separate people dealing with their own issues. They're part of an interconnected web where one person's healing or breakdown affects everyone else. And isn't that true for most of us? Maybe not to this dramatic extent, but think about how your siblings' successes and failures ripple through your own sense of self, how their choices can trigger old family patterns you thought you'd outgrown. The Wingo siblings remind us that family isn't just about blood or shared DNA. It's about shared mythology, shared survival strategies, and shared wounds that sometimes heal together and sometimes fester together. As we move deeper into Tom's story, we'll see how confronting Savannah's crisis forces him to examine not just his relationship with his sister, but the entire architecture of how the Wingo children learn to love and protect each other. It's a masterclass in how the most profound bonds can also be the most complicated ones. You know, there's something about settling in with a good cup of coffee and really diving into the heart of a story that just feels right, doesn't it? And speaking of hearts, we're about to explore one of the most tender and brutal aspects of Pat Conroy's masterpiece, The Prince of Tides. We're talking about parental influence, and let me tell you, this isn't your typical feel-good family story. This is raw, honest, and painfully beautiful in the way that only Conroy can deliver. Think about this for a moment. How much of who you are today can be traced back to the kitchen table conversations, the bedtime stories, or maybe the silences that filled your childhood home? In The Prince of Tides, Tom Wingo carries the weight of his parents like stones in his pockets, each memory both a burden and a treasure that shaped the man he became. Let's start with Leela Wingo, Tom's mother, because she's a force of nature wrapped in southern charm and devastating beauty. Picture this. A woman so stunning she could stop traffic, so intelligent she could have conquered the world, but trapped in a time and place where her only acceptable role was as wife and mother. Conroy paints her as this magnificent, wounded creature who wielded love and cruelty with equal measure. She was the kind of mother who could make you feel like the most special child in the universe one moment, then cut you down with a single glance the next. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. Leela's influence on her children wasn't just about what she said or did, it was about what she represented. She embodied this impossible standard of perfection, this idea that appearances mattered more than truth, that keeping up the facade was worth any sacrifice. Think about how many of us carry that burden today, don't we? That voice in our heads that says we're not enough, that we need to be prettier, smarter, more successful to earn love. Tom describes how his mother's moods could change the entire atmosphere of their home. When she was happy, their little house on the South Carolina coast felt like paradise. When she was angry or disappointed, it became a minefield where one wrong step could trigger an explosion. This is the kind of parental influence that doesn't just shape childhood, it rewires the nervous system. It teaches children to become emotional meteorologists, constantly reading the barometric pressure of adult moods. But then there's Henry Wingo, Tom's father, and he represents a completely different kind of damage. Where Leela was fire and fury, Henry was absence and indifference. He was the kind of father who was physically present but emotionally unavailable, a man so beaten down by his own failures that he had nothing left to give his children. Conroy shows us how this kind of neglect can be just as devastating as active abuse, maybe even more so because there's nothing concrete to push against, no clear enemy to fight. Here's what's so brilliant about Conroy's portrayal of these parents. He doesn't make them monsters. They're deeply flawed human beings who were themselves products of their own damaged childhoods. Leela grew up poor and powerless, using her beauty as the only weapon she had in a world that didn't value women's minds. Henry came from a long line of men who measured their worth by their ability to provide, and when he couldn't do that consistently, he simply disappeared into himself. Now, think about this in terms of your own life, or the families you know today. How often do we see parents unconsciously passing down their own unhealed wounds? The anxious parent who creates anxious children, not through any malicious intent, but simply by modeling that the world is a dangerous place that requires constant vigilance. The parent who never learned to express emotions healthily, so their children grow up thinking love looks like drama, that passion and pain are inseparable. What Conroy captures so beautifully is this truth. Our parents' influence on us isn't just about the big moments, the dramatic scenes that make for good therapy stories. It's about the thousand small interactions, the daily rhythms of family life that become the background music of our souls. It's about learning what normal looks like, what love sounds like, what safety feels like, all before we even have the vocabulary to name these experiences. Tom carries both of his parents within him like genetic memories. From his mother, he inherited a deep appreciation for beauty, language, and the power of storytelling. But he also inherited her perfectionism, her tendency to use charm as a shield, and her belief that love must be earned through performance. From his father, he got a bone-deep understanding of what it feels like to be invisible, to have your worth questioned, to carry shame like a second skin. And here's the thing about parental influence that Conroy understands so well. It's not destiny. Yes, we carry our parents' voices, their fears, their dreams, their limitations. But we also have the power to choose which parts of that inheritance we keep and which parts we transform. Tom's journey in the novel is really about learning to separate himself from his parents' story while still honoring the parts of them that made him who he is. As we wrap up this exploration of how deeply our parents shape us, remember that understanding this influence is the first step toward healing it. Conroy shows us that the most powerful thing we can do is tell our stories honestly, to shine light into those dark corners where shame and secrets live, because that's where real freedom begins. You know how sometimes you're sitting with an old family photo, and suddenly you notice something in the background you never saw before. Maybe it's a shadow that tells a different story, or an expression on someone's face that completely changes how you remember that day. That's exactly what happens in the most devastating and transformative section of Pat Conroy's masterpiece, where the carefully constructed walls of the Wingo family finally crumble, revealing truths so shocking they redefine everything we thought we knew about love, protection, and survival. Picture this scene with me for a moment. Tom Wingo is sitting across from Dr. Susan Lowenstein in her pristine Manhattan office, and he's been dancing around the edges of his family's deepest wounds for weeks now. He's told her about his father's violence, his mother's social climbing, the poverty that shaped them all. But there's something else lurking beneath the surface, something so terrible that even now, decades later, his mind recoils from it like touching a hot stove. And then, in one of the most powerful moments in American literature, the dam breaks. The revelation that emerges is this. When Tom, his twin sister Savannah, and their younger brother Luke were children, 3 escaped convicts broke into their isolated island home. What followed was a night of unspeakable horror that the family, in a conspiracy of silence orchestrated by their mother Leela, agreed to never speak of again. The children were brutalized, violated, and traumatized in ways that would echo through their entire lives. But here's what makes this revelation so much more than just a plot twist. It's the key that unlocks everything we've been trying to understand about this family's particular brand of dysfunction. Think about this for a moment. How many families do you know that have these unspoken agreements? Not necessarily about trauma this severe, but about things we simply don't discuss. Maybe it's Uncle Jerry's drinking problem that everyone pretends doesn't exist, or the way Grandpa treated Grandma that no one ever acknowledges. Conroy is showing us how silence becomes its own form of violence, how the things we refuse to name often have more power over us than the things we face head-on. What's particularly devastating about this revelation is how it reframes every relationship in the story. Suddenly, Savannah's suicide attempts aren't just the actions of a troubled poet. They're the desperate attempts of a woman trying to escape a pain she's never been allowed to process. Tom's inability to connect emotionally with his own family isn't just masculine stoicism. It's the learned behavior of someone who discovered as a child that the world isn't safe, that the people who are supposed to protect you might fail you in the most fundamental ways. And here's where Conroy's genius really shines through. He doesn't present this revelation as an excuse for every bad choice these characters have made. Instead, he shows us how trauma ripples through generations, how the decision to stay silent about horror can be both an act of survival and a form of slow poisoning. Leela Wingo's insistence that the family never speak of that night wasn't just denial. It was her attempt to control a narrative that had spun completely out of her control. She believed, in her own twisted way, that if they didn't acknowledge what happened, they could somehow undo it. Now, think about how this plays out in our modern world. We live in an era where we're finally beginning to understand trauma in more sophisticated ways. We know about PTSD, about how the body keeps the score, about intergenerational trauma. But back when this story takes place, And even when Conroy was writing it in the 1980s, these concepts weren't part of our everyday vocabulary. Families like the Wingos were left to figure out their own ways of coping, often with devastating results. What makes this revelation so powerful is how it illuminates the different ways people respond to the same trauma. Luke, the youngest, channeled his rage into a kind of environmental activism that bordered on terrorism. Savannah turned inward, using poetry and eventually self-destruction as her outlets. Tom became the family historian, the one who remembered everything but felt nothing, until Dr. Lowenstein forced him to connect his memories to his emotions. The beauty of Conroy's storytelling here is that he never lets us off the hook with simple explanations. Yes, this terrible night explains so much about the Wingo family's dysfunction, but it doesn't excuse Tom's failures as a husband and father. It doesn't make Leela's social climbing and emotional coldness acceptable. Instead, it adds layers of complexity that make these characters feel achingly human. As we sit with this revelation, sipping our coffee and trying to process its implications, we're reminded that every family has its secrets, its unspoken traumas, its agreements about what can and cannot be discussed. The question Conroy leaves us with is this: what happens when we finally find the courage to break those silences, and what are we willing to sacrifice in the pursuit of truth? Picture this. You're sitting across from someone who spent decades carrying the weight of family secrets, and suddenly, they're ready to unpack it all. That's exactly where we find ourselves in Pat Conroy's masterpiece, as Tom Wingo embarks on what might be the most crucial journey of his life. Not a physical one, but an emotional excavation that will either destroy him or set him free. The healing journey in The Prince of Tides isn't your typical redemption story with neat, tidy resolutions. No, Conroy understood something profound about the human condition. Healing isn't linear, and it certainly isn't pretty. Think about the last time you tried to clean out a storage room that hadn't been touched in years. You know how everything gets worse before it gets better. How you have to pull everything out into the light, sort through the debris, and decide what's worth keeping. That's exactly what Tom Wingo faces as he begins to confront the trauma that has shaped not just his life, but his entire family's legacy. Now, here's where Conroy's genius really shines through. He doesn't give us a hero who suddenly sees the light and transforms overnight. Instead, we watch Tom struggle with the messy, uncomfortable reality of facing his past. The healing process begins when Tom travels to New York to help his suicidal sister Savannah, but what he discovers is that you can't heal someone else until you're willing to examine your own wounds. It's like trying to perform surgery with infected hands. The very tools you're using to help might be causing more harm. The reconciliation Tom seeks isn't just with his family members who are still breathing, but with the ghosts of his past, the version of himself he's been running from, and the father whose violence cast such a long shadow over their childhood. Have you ever noticed how family trauma has this peculiar way of echoing through generations? Conroy captures this beautifully through Tom's relationship with his own children. He's desperate not to repeat his father's mistakes, yet he finds himself trapped in patterns he swore he'd never perpetuate. What makes this healing journey so compelling is how Conroy weaves together the personal and the universal. Tom's therapy sessions with Dr. Susan Lowenstein become a kind of archaeological dig, where each session unearths another layer of buried pain. But here's the thing that resonates so powerfully today. In our age of social media perfection and carefully curated lives, Tom's willingness to sit with his ugliest truths feels revolutionary. He has to confront not just what happened to his family, but his own complicity in maintaining the silence that allowed the wounds to fester. The process isn't gentle. Healing rarely is. Tom has to revisit the night that changed everything, the trauma that his family buried so deep they convinced themselves it never happened. It's like having to reset a bone that healed incorrectly. You have to break it again to make it right. The courage required for this kind of emotional honesty is staggering, and Conroy doesn't shy away from showing us just how excruciating it can be. But here's where the story becomes truly transformative. As Tom begins to speak the unspeakable, something shifts not just in him, but in his understanding of his entire family system. His mother's coldness, his father's rage, Savannah's artistic brilliance and mental fragility. Suddenly, these aren't just random character traits but responses to shared trauma. It's like finally understanding that the family you thought was broken was actually a group of people doing their best to survive something that nearly destroyed them all. The reconciliation that emerges isn't a fairy tale ending where everyone hugs and forgives and lives happily ever after. Instead, it's something more realistic and, ultimately, more hopeful. It's the recognition that love and damage can coexist, that you can acknowledge the harm someone caused while still honoring the complexity of who they were. Tom's relationship with his father's memory evolves from simple hatred to something more nuanced, an understanding that his father, too, was a product of forces beyond his control. What strikes me most about Tom's healing journey is how it mirrors our contemporary understanding of trauma and recovery. Decades before we had terms like generational trauma or complex PTSD, Conroy was exploring how pain moves through families like a virus, how silence can be more destructive than the original wound, and how healing requires not just individual courage, but a willingness to reconstruct the very stories we tell ourselves about who we are and where we come from. As we move forward in Tom's story, we're left with this profound truth. Healing isn't about forgetting or forgiving everything, but about learning to carry our wounds with grace, transforming them from sources of shame into wellsprings of compassion and understanding. Picture yourself settling into that favorite chair with your morning coffee, steam rising from the cup like memories themselves. We've been journeying through Pat Conroy's magnificent tapestry of human experience in The Prince of Tides. And today, we're diving into perhaps the most universal thread woven throughout this masterpiece, the intricate dance between love and loss that defines every human heart. You know, there's something almost cruel about how Conroy presents love in this novel. It's never simple, never clean, never the kind of love we see in romantic comedies where everything ties up neatly with a bow. Instead, he shows us love as it really exists in our messy, complicated lives, fierce and tender, healing and destructive, sometimes all at once. Think about Tom Wingo, our narrator, whose love for his family is so deep it's become both his salvation and his prison. Have you ever loved someone so much that it actually hurt? That's the kind of love Conroy understands, the kind that leaves scars even as it sustains us. The Wingo family embodies every form of love imaginable, and with each form comes its shadow of loss. There's the protective love Tom feels for his siblings, Luke and Savannah, a love born from shared trauma that becomes their lifeline through childhood horrors. But here's what's so heartbreaking. That same protective love becomes a burden Tom carries into adulthood, making him feel responsible for every pain his family endures. It's like being a lighthouse keeper who blames himself every time a ship crashes on distant rocks. The love is real, the dedication absolute, but the responsibility he's taken on is impossible to fulfill. Now think about this. How many of us carry that same weight? How many of us love so fiercely that we forget where our responsibility ends and someone else's begins? Conroy shows us through Tom's relationship with his suicidal sister Savannah that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is recognize the limits of our power to save others. It's a lesson that resonates deeply in our age of social media, where we're constantly bombarded with others' struggles and feel somehow obligated to fix what we cannot even fully understand. The romantic love between Tom and Dr. Susan Lowenstein presents another layer of complexity. Here we see love as a force of healing, but also as a betrayal of existing commitments. Their affair isn't just about passion, it's about recognition, about seeing and being seen in ways that feel impossible within the confines of their established lives. Lowenstein sees past Tom's good old boy facade to the wounded poet beneath, while Tom offers her a glimpse of the passionate woman hidden behind her professional armor. But this love, beautiful as it is, comes at the cost of other loves: Tom's marriage, Lowenstein's relationship with her husband, the stability both have built their lives upon. It's fascinating how Conroy refuses to make moral judgments about this affair. Instead, he presents it as another example of love's complexity, how it can simultaneously destroy and create, how it can be both selfish and selfless. In today's world, where we're quick to categorize relationships as either toxic or healthy, Conroy reminds us that real love often exists in the gray areas, defying our neat labels and forcing us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature. The loss that permeates every page of this novel isn't just about death, though there's plenty of that. It's about the loss of innocence, the loss of family unity, the loss of dreams deferred too long. Tom loses his childhood to his father's violence, his sense of safety to family secrets, his marriage to emotional distance. But perhaps most profoundly, he loses his ability to trust that love can exist without pain. Every act of love in his life has come with a price tag of suffering, creating a worldview where intimacy feels dangerous, and vulnerability seems like a luxury he can't afford. Yet here's where Conroy's genius truly shines. He shows us that even in the midst of devastating loss, love persists. It transforms, it adapts, it finds new channels, but it endures. The love between the Wingo siblings survives abuse, mental illness, and even death. Tom's love for his children transcends his marital problems. His newfound love for Lowenstein doesn't diminish his capacity for other loves. It expands it, teaching him that the heart isn't a finite resource but an infinite wellspring. As we close this exploration of love and loss in Conroy's masterwork, consider how these themes echo in your own life. Love and loss aren't opposing forces, they're dance partners, each giving meaning to the other. Without loss, love lacks urgency. Without love, loss lacks significance. Conroy understood this fundamental truth about human existence, and in sharing it with us, he offers not answers but companionship in our own complex emotional journeys. Picture this: you're sitting across from someone you care about, and they're pouring out their heart to you about something that's been eating them alive for years. Maybe it's a childhood trauma, maybe it's a regret that haunts their sleep, or perhaps it's a family secret that's been festering like an untreated wound. What happens in that moment when they finally speak their truth out loud? There's something almost magical about it, isn't there? This is exactly what Pat Conroy captures so brilliantly in The Prince of Tides, through the power of storytelling as a healing force. Tom Wingo, our narrator, doesn't set out to be a storyteller or a healer. He's just a man trying to save his sister Savannah, who's attempted suicide again, and he finds himself in the Manhattan office of Dr. Susan Lowenstein, a psychiatrist who needs to understand Savannah's past to help her present. But here's where Conroy works his magic. Tom realizes that to explain his sister, he has to tell their story, the whole messy, beautiful, terrible story of the Wingo family. And in doing so, he discovers something profound. The act of telling their story doesn't just help Savannah, it begins to heal him too. Now think about this for a moment. How often do we carry around stories that feel too heavy, too shameful, or too painful to share? We stuff them down, thinking that silence will make them disappear. But Conroy shows us that the opposite is true. When Tom begins to narrate their childhood in the South Carolina Lowcountry, describing everything from their abusive father to the sexual assault that shattered their family, something remarkable happens. The stories don't lose their power to hurt, but they begin to lose their power to control. There's this incredible scene where Tom is describing their father, Henry Wingo, and all the ways this man damaged his children. But as Tom tells these stories to Dr. Lowenstein, you can almost feel the weight shifting. The stories are still painful, but now they're outside of him, shared, witnessed, no longer his burden alone to carry. It's like that moment when you finally tell someone about the monster under your bed as a child, and suddenly it's not quite so monstrous anymore. What makes this even more powerful is how Conroy weaves together the personal and the universal. Tom's stories about growing up in the South, about family dysfunction, about the intersection of beauty and brutality in their lives, these aren't just his stories. They're our stories too, in different forms. When he talks about how his mother, Leela, created elaborate fantasies to cope with their harsh reality, or how the three Wingo children learned to survive by creating their own secret language of understanding, we recognize something fundamental about how humans cope with trauma. The genius of what Conroy does here is showing us that storytelling isn't just about entertainment or even catharsis, though it certainly provides both. It's about making meaning from chaos. When terrible things happen to us, especially as children, they often feel random, senseless, like cosmic cruelty. But when we can tell the story of what happened, when we can shape it with our words and our perspective, we begin to reclaim some power over our own narrative. Consider how this works in our modern world. We see it in support groups where people share their struggles with addiction, in therapy sessions where clients work through trauma, in memoirs that help both writer and reader process difficult experiences. We see it in social media, where people share their mental health journeys, their recovery stories, their tales of overcoming adversity. The medium might be different, but the fundamental human need to tell our stories and be heard remains unchanged. Dr. Lowenstein represents something crucial in this process: the witness, the one who listens without judgment and helps us see patterns we might have missed. She doesn't just passively receive Tom's stories, she helps him understand them differently. When Tom tells her about his father's violence, she helps him see how it shaped not just his childhood but his adult relationships, his own struggles with anger and intimacy. But here's what's really beautiful about Conroy's treatment of this theme: the healing isn't neat or complete. Tom doesn't tell his stories and suddenly become whole. Instead, he begins to understand that his wounds and his stories are part of who he is, not something to be ashamed of or to hide. The storytelling doesn't erase the pain, but it transforms it into something he can live with, something that connects him to others rather than isolating him. This transformation through storytelling becomes a bridge between past and present, between Tom and Savannah, between the reader and their own untold stories, reminding us that sometimes the most powerful medicine isn't found in a prescription bottle, but in the simple, revolutionary act of speaking our truth aloud. So we've been walking through this devastating and beautiful journey with Tom Wingo, and now we arrive at what I consider the emotional earthquake of the entire novel. Picture this. You're sitting across from me with your coffee getting cold because you're so absorbed in what's happening, and I'm about to tell you about the moment when everything Tom has been running from finally catches up with him in the most unexpected way. The climax of The Prince of Tides isn't some Hollywood explosion or dramatic car chase. Instead, it's something far more terrifying and transformative: the complete unraveling of a family secret so toxic it's been poisoning 3 generations. Tom finds himself in Dr. Susan Lowenstein's office, not as the charming Southern storyteller he's been playing, but as a broken man finally ready to excavate the truth that's been buried so deep he's almost convinced himself it never happened. Now think about this for a moment. How many of us walk around carrying secrets that feel too heavy to share, too shameful to speak aloud? Tom has been the family's designated keeper of stories, the one who spins beautiful tales about South Carolina tides and shrimp boats, but he's been protecting the darkest story of all: the night that changed everything. The night when violence invaded their home and shattered not just their bodies, but their very understanding of who they were as a family. Conroy masterfully builds to this revelation through what feels like layers of an onion being peeled away. First, we get glimpses of Tom's sister Savannah's breakdown, her poetry filled with cryptic references to trauma. Then we see Luke's rage, his desperate need to fight against everything and everyone. And finally, we arrive at Tom himself, the middle child who survived by becoming the family narrator, the one who could make even the ugliest truths sound like folklore. The actual revelation is devastating in its simplicity. 3 escaped convicts, a night of terror, a family forever changed. But here's what makes Conroy's handling of this so brilliant. He doesn't sensationalize the violence. Instead, he focuses on something far more profound. How trauma becomes a living thing that moves through a family like water through sand, invisible but reshaping everything it touches. Think about how this works in our own lives. Maybe you've never experienced anything as dramatic as what the Wingo family endured, but haven't we all seen how one terrible event can ripple through generations? The grandfather who never talked about the war, whose silence created an anxiety that his children inherited without understanding why. The mother who was abandoned as a child and spent her life either clinging too tightly or pushing too hard. The father whose own father's anger became a template for how men express frustration. What's particularly powerful about this climax is how Conroy shows us that the real tragedy wasn't just what happened that night, but what the family did with it afterward. The conspiracy of silence. The way they agreed, without ever discussing it, to pretend it never occurred. Leela, their mother, orchestrating this elaborate cover-up not out of wisdom, but out of her own inability to process what had happened to her children. This is where the novel becomes almost unbearably relevant to our current understanding of trauma. We know now what Conroy intuited then, that secrets don't protect us, they imprison us. The Wingo family's attempt to bury this experience didn't make it go away. Instead, it turned into a kind of emotional cancer, manifesting in Savannah's mental illness, Luke's self-destructive rebellion, and Tom's inability to truly connect with his own life. But here's the thing that gives me chills every time I think about it. The moment when Tom finally tells this story to Dr. Lowenstein, something miraculous happens. Not healing exactly, because healing from trauma isn't that simple or that fast, but something like liberation. The story, once spoken, loses some of its power to control him. It becomes something that happened to him rather than something that defines him. This is the real climax of the novel, not the revelation of what happened, but the act of finally speaking it aloud. Conroy understands something profound about the human condition here. We are storytelling creatures, and the stories we can't tell are the ones that end up telling us. They become the invisible scripts that run our lives, the unconscious patterns that determine how we love, how we work, how we see ourselves in the world. As we move toward the resolution of Tom's journey, we're left with this question that haunts every page of Conroy's work. What do we do with the stories that break us? How do we transform the narratives that threaten to destroy us into something that might, eventually, save us? Well, my friend, here we are at the end of our journey through the turbulent waters of the Wingo family saga, and what a ride it's been. As we close the final pages of Pat Conroy's masterpiece, I can't help but think about how this story lingers with you long after you've set the book down. It's like that last sip of really good coffee that stays warm in your chest, reminding you of something profound you've just experienced. The epilogue of The Prince of Tides doesn't tie everything up in a neat little bow, and thank goodness for that. Life isn't neat, is it? Instead, Conroy gives us something far more valuable, the understanding that healing is possible, even when the wounds run deeper than ocean trenches. Tom Wingo has traveled through his own personal hell and emerged not unscathed, but transformed. Think about this for a moment. How often do we expect people to bounce back from trauma as if nothing happened? But Conroy shows us that real healing isn't about forgetting or pretending the pain never existed. It's about integrating those experiences into who we become. Now, consider how relevant this is to our world today. We live in an age where mental health struggles are finally being acknowledged, where therapy isn't whispered about in shame but discussed openly over dinner tables. Tom's journey with Dr. Susan Lowenstein isn't just about saving his sister Savannah. It becomes about saving himself. And isn't that often how it works? We think we're helping others, only to discover we're the ones who needed rescuing all along. It's like when you volunteer at a shelter thinking you're giving something to others, but you walk away having received far more than you gave. The beauty of this epilogue lies in its acknowledgement that family wounds can be both our greatest burden and our most powerful teacher. The Wingo family, with all their secrets and silences, their violence and tenderness, represent something universal about the human experience. We all carry the ghosts of our childhood, don't we? Those moments when we felt powerless, when the adults who were supposed to protect us failed, when we learned that love and pain could exist in the same breath. But here's where Conroy's wisdom really shines through. He doesn't suggest that understanding your past automatically fixes everything. Tom doesn't emerge from his therapeutic journey as a completely different person. He's still the same man who loves the South Carolina Lowcountry with a passion that borders on obsession, still the storyteller who can make the ordinary seem magical. What changes is his relationship to his own story. He stops being a victim of his narrative and becomes its author. Think about the metaphor of the tides that runs throughout this entire novel. Tides don't fight the moon's pull, they work with it, flowing in and out in an eternal rhythm. By the epilogue, Tom has learned to work with the rhythm of his own life rather than fighting against it. He's made peace with the fact that some pain will always ebb and flow through his consciousness, but he's no longer drowning in it. This resonates so powerfully in our current moment, where we're collectively grappling with generational trauma, where young people are asking hard questions about family patterns and inherited pain. How many of us have had to learn, as adults, to parent ourselves in ways our own parents couldn't? How many have discovered that forgiveness isn't about excusing harmful behavior, but about refusing to let that behavior continue to harm us? The epilogue also speaks to the power of storytelling itself as a form of healing. Tom's ability to narrate his family's story, to give voice to the silences that nearly destroyed them, becomes a kind of liberation. In our age of social media and oversharing, there's something profound about Conroy's suggestion that the stories that matter most are often the ones we're most afraid to tell. As we close this book together, I'm struck by how Conroy leaves us with hope that's been earned rather than simply given. Tom's journey reminds us that we don't have to be perfect to be worthy of love, that we don't have to have all the answers to move forward, and that sometimes the greatest act of courage is simply choosing to keep living, keep loving, keep believing in the possibility of something better. So as you finish your coffee and reflect on this remarkable story, remember that like the tides themselves, healing happens in its own time, following rhythms we can't always control but can learn to trust. The Prince of Tides teaches us that our scars don't disqualify us from happiness. Sometimes, they're exactly what qualifies us for the deepest kind of joy. Pat Conroy's The Prince of Tides is a novel that masterfully interweaves the complexities of family, trauma, and the redemptive power of storytelling. Through Tom Wingo's journey, the book explores the deep-seated wounds inflicted by family secrets and the arduous path to healing. Tom, alongside his twin sister Savannah, navigates the turbulent waters of their past, ultimately finding solace in confronting their shared pain. Here are some key takeaways from the novel. 1. Face your past to heal your present. Tom's journey teaches us that healing begins with confronting the truths of our past. Start incredibly small by writing down one memory each day. Be patient with yourself as you recall and release these memories. 2. The power of storytelling. The act of narrating their family saga helps both Tom and Savannah process their emotions and experiences. Share your own story with a trusted friend or even a journal. It can be liberating and offers a new perspective on old wounds. 3. Family bonds are complex, yet vital. Despite the dysfunction, the Wingo family demonstrates the undeniable ties that bind family members. Reach out to a loved one you've lost touch with. A small gesture can rekindle important connections. 4. Embrace vulnerability. Tom learns that vulnerability is not a weakness but a strength. Practice opening up slightly more each day. Even admitting a small fear or worry to someone you trust can be empowering. 5. Never underestimate the impact of nature. The novel beautifully illustrates how the South Carolina Lowcountry shapes its inhabitants. Spend time in nature, even if it's just a walk in a local park. It can offer peace and a sense of grounding. Before you go, I'd love to hear from you. Drop a comment below with at least one idea from this book that stuck with you, one concept you're going to carry forward. It could be something that challenged your thinking, something you want to try, or even something you disagreed with. Your insight might be exactly what another listener needs to hear today. And if this summary gave you something valuable, a new perspective, a spark of motivation, or even just a peaceful hour with your coffee, share it with someone who might need it too. Subscribe to One Book, One Coffee, and hit that bell icon so you never miss a new summary. Every week, we sit down together with one great book, one warm cup of coffee, and the simple belief that wisdom, shared well, can change lives. Until next time, keep reading, keep growing, and remember, every small step counts. See you at the next book.